Abe was frustrated by the futility of the situation, by the limitations of what he, and some 20 other individuals, could accomplish to protect hundreds of thousands of civilians, from more than 50,000 Japanese soldiers. He did not show it. He knew it was crucial to hide any sign of weakness from the Japanese and to overwhelm them with a domineering presence and energy. Fortunately, his status as a Nazi caused several Japanese soldiers to hesitate before committing further mayhem, at least in his presence. George Fitch, the local YMCA secretary, wrote that when any of them objects Rabe thrusts his Nazi armband in their face and points to his Nazi decoration, the highest state in the country, and asks them if they know what that means. It always works. The Japanese soldiers appeared to respect, at times even fear, the Nazis of Nanking, while the Japanese privates did not hesitate to beat up the Americans, charge at them with bayonets, or even to push one American missionary down a flight of stairs. They exercised considerable the Nanking Safety Zone 121 restraint in their dealings with Rabe and his countrymen. Once, when 4 Japanese soldiers, in the midst of raping and looting, saw Edward Sperling's swastika armband, they screamed Deutsch, Deutsch, and ran away. On another occasion, the swastika probably saved Rabe's life. One evening, Japanese soldiers broke into his property, and Rabe confronted them with his flashlight. One of them reached for his pistol, as if to shoot Rabe, but stopped when he realized it would be bad business to shoot a German subject. If the Japanese respected Rabe, the Chinese refugee community revered him. To them he was the man who rescued daughters from sexual slavery and sons from machine gun fire. Rabe's very presence sometimes touched off riots in safety zone camps. During one of his visits to the zone, thousands of Chinese women flung themselves to the ground before him, weeping and begging for protection, declaring they would rather commit suicide on the spot than leave the zone to be raped and tortured. Rabe tried to keep hope alive for his refugees in the midst of their terror. He hosted little birthday celebrations for the children bombed to refugee women living in his backyard. Each newborn received a gift, $10 for baby boys and $9.50 for baby girls. As Rabe explained in his report to Hitler, girls in China aren't worth as much as boys. Typically, when a boy was born, he received Rabe's name, and if a girl was bombed, she received his wife's name, Dora. Rabe's courage and generosity ultimately won the respect of the other members of the International Committee, even those fundamentally opposed to Nazism. George Fitch wrote to his friends that he would almost wear a Nazi badge to keep fellowship with Rabe and the other Germans in Nanking. Even Dr. Robert Wilson, a man thoroughly repulsed by Nazism, sang Rabe's praises in letters to his family. He is well up in Nazi circles, and after coming into such close contact with him, as we have for the past few weeks, and discovering what a splendid man he is and what a tremendous heart he has, it is hard to reconcile his personality with his adulation of Der Führer. The only surgeon in Nanking. It is not surprising that Robert Wilson stayed in Nanking when virtually every other surgeon left, for Nanking, the city of his birth and boyhood, had always commanded a special place in his heart. Born in 1904, Wilson was reared by a family of Methodist missionaries who had shaped many of Nanking's educational institutions. His uncle, John Ferguson, founded the University of Nanking. His father worked as an ordained minister and middle school instructor in the city, while his mother, a college-educated Greek scholar who spoke several languages fluently, ran her own school for missionary children. As a teenager, Robert Wilson even learned geometry from Pearl Buck, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Literature for her novels about China. Thriving in this environment and displaying exceptional intellectual promise, Wilson won, at age 17, a scholarship to Princeton University. Upon graduation from college, he taught Latin and mathematics for 2 years at a high school in Connecticut, enrolled in Harvard Medical School, and then served as an intern at St. Luke's Hospital in New York, where he courted and married the head nurse. But rather than pursue a career in the United States, Wilson decided that his future lay in his hometown of Nanking, and taking his bride with him, he returned in 1935 to practice medicine at the University of Nanking Hospital. The first 2 years for the Wilsons were perhaps the most idyllic of their lives. Time was marked by a slow-paced, charm dinners, with other missionary couples, elegant teas and receptions at foreign embassies, parties at sprawling Kun Trai villas staffed with private cooks and coolies. In the evenings he read ancient Chinese, in its original text, and studied under a private tutor, to expand his knowledge of the language. He also took every Wednesday afternoon off to play tennis. Sometimes he and his wife would go to the lake together, and have dinner on a boat, inhaling the perfumed air, as they drifted through watery lanes of red lotus blossom. War, however, shattered forever the timeless serenity the Wilsons had enjoyed in Nanking. After the Marco Polo Bridge, the Nanking Safety Zone 123 incident, in July, the people of Nanking began to carry gas masks in the street, along with chemical solution and layers of gauze, fearing a Japanese poison gas attack. By August 1937, when the Japanese started to bomb the capital, his wife Marjorie had boarded a gunboat with their infant daughter Elizabeth, and arrived safely at Ruling. But Wilson, fearing his wife and child would starve to death if the war continued, insisted that they return to the United States. Mrs. Wilson complied with his wishes, and went back to work at St. Luke's in New York while her mother cared for the baby. But there was no question that Dr. Wilson himself would stay in Nanking. He saw this as his duty, his wife recalled, almost 60 years later. The Chinese were his people. No doubt to dispel loneliness that autumn, Wilson moved into the house of J. Lossing Buck, the former husband of Pearl Buck, and the house soon filled up with his friends, the Sir John Richard Brady, the United Christian missionary James McCallum, and other people, who would later serve as members of the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. Like Wilson, many of these men had sent their wives and children away from Nanking. When he wasn't busy with patients, Wilson often wrote letters home to his family. Most contained gruesome descriptions of the victims of Japanese bombs, such as the girl who had crouched with her back to an explosion, only to have her buttocks ripped off. From the casualties of war, he dug out a growing heap of shrapnel and bullets, enough, he wrote cynically, to open a respectable museum before the war was over. Even though he knew that the Japanese had no qualms about bombing hospitals, Wilson continued to go to work. On September 25, in one of the worst air raids Nanking had ever experienced, the Japanese aimed two 1,000-pound bombs at the Central Hospital and Ministry of Health, despite the presence of a large Red Cross clearly painted on one of the roofs. The bombs landed only 50 feet away from a dugout where 100 doctors and nurses were hiding. Wilson did everything possible in the hospital to minimize the risk of attracting Japanese bombs. Heavy black curtains were drawn over the windows to hide lit rooms from Japanese aviators. But the city crawled with rumors of spies guiding pilots to key targets with red and green lanterns at night. During one raid, a stranger crept into the hospital with a red shielded flashlight instead of a green or black shielded one, and aroused suspicions when he tried to open a window that had been securely shut to prevent the seepage of poison gas. He raised even more eyebrows when he asked a Chinese aviator patient a number of unusual questions about the flying height and range of Chinese bombers. As autumn drew to a close, Wilson found himself tremendously overworked. More people needed medical attention than ever before, not only civilian victims of Japanese bombs, but veterans from Shanghai. There were approximately 100,000 wounded Chinese veterans in hospitals between Shanghai and the city of Wuhu. Trainload after trainload dumped them off at the station in Xiaquan, the northern Nanking suburb. Some lay dying on the floor of the station, while others limped aimlessly through the capital. Soldiers who healed were returned to the front, but those who lost arms or legs, those crippled beyond hope, were simply turned loose with $2 compensations and instructions to go home. Home was far away for most soldiers. Few had the money or physical energy to get there. Abandoned by their leaders, stranded in the Shanghai Nanking area, thousands of Chinese veterans, blind, lame, rotting away from wounds and infections, were reduced to begging in the streets. As the situation worsened, the staff at the hospital shrank. Chinese doctors and nurses fled the city, joining the hundreds of thousands of Nanking residents in their westward migration. Wilson did all he could to dissuade his medical staff from leaving, insisting that under martial law, they would have nothing to fear after the city fell. Ultimately, however, he was unable to convince them to stay. By the end of the first week of December, there were only 3 doctors at the University of Nanking Hospital: Robert Wilson C.S. Trimmer, and a Chinese physician. When Richard Brady, the only other American surgeon in the city, left Nanking because his little girl was the Nanking Safety Zone 125 obviously ill and ruling, Wilson was the only person left to perform the early amputations. It is quite a sensation / he wrote on December 7th, to be the only surgeon in a big wartime city. A week later, Wilson nearly lost his life. On the afternoon of December 13th, he had decided to perform a delicate operation on a patient who had suffered severe eye injury from a bomb. Wilson had to remove what was left of the eye in order to save the other one. The eyeball was halfway out when a shell landed 50 yards away from Wilson and exploded, shattering the windows and spraying the room with shrapnel. No one was killed or injured, but Wilson noted that the nurses were naturally pretty shaky and wanted to know whether they should continue the operation. There was obviously nothing else to do, Wilson wrote, but I don't think any eyes have come out that fast. By nightfall of December 13th, the Japanese had seized complete control of the ancient capital. Wilson saw Japanese flags fluttering all over town. The following day, the conquering army began to take over the hospitals in the city. They broke into the main hospital of the Chinese army, located within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and run by safety zone members who had organized themselves as a chapter of the Red Cross, and trapped hundreds of Chinese soldiers inside. The Japanese forbade doctors to enter the hospital or send food to the wounded soldiers, who were later marched out and systematically shot. After 3 out of 4 Red Cross hospitals fell in this manner to the Japanese, the International Committee concentrated its efforts on the University of Nanking Hospital. During the first few days of occupation, Wilson watched the Japanese soldiers loot and burn the city. He saw them rob the University of Nanking Hospital, and frustrated that he could not stop all of the thefts, mentally aimed a swift kick at a soldier who tried to steal a camera from a nurse. He also watched soldiers bum a heap of musical instruments in the street and wondered whether the destruction of property was a Japanese plot to compel the people of Nanking to buy Japanese goods later. Wilson even witnessed the ransacking of his own home. Venturing to his house to survey possible damage, he caught red-handed 3 Japanese soldiers in the process of looting it. They had broken into the attic, opened up a big trunk, and strewn its contents all over the floor. One of them was peering into a microscope when Wilson walked in. Upon seeing him, all 3 soldiers ran down the stairs and out the door. The crowning insult was on the 2nd floor, where one had just finished depositing his calling card on the floor of the toilet within a foot of the toilet bowl. Wilson wrote. He had covered it with a clean towel, which had been left hanging in the room. But nothing of the looting could compare to the rape and murder that he witnessed in the city. Even Wilson, now jaded war surgeon, found the intensity of the atrocities shocking. December 15th. The slaughter of civilians is appalling. One could go on for pages, telling of cases of rape and brutality almost beyond belief. December 18th. Today marks the 6th day of modern Dante's Inferno, written in huge letters, with blood and rape. Murder by the wholesale and rape by the thousands of cases. There seems to be no stop to the ferocity, lust and atavism of the brutes. At first I tried to be pleasant to them, to avoid arousing their ire, but the smile has gradually worn off, and my stare is fully as cool and fishy as theirs. December 19th. All the food is being stolen from the poor people, and they are in a state of terror-stricken, hysterical panic. When will it stop? Christmas Eve. Now they tell us that there are 20,000 soldiers still in the zone where they get their figures no one knows, and that they are going to hunt them out and shoot them all. That will mean every able-bodied male between the ages of 18 and 50 that is now in the city. How can they ever look anybody in the face again? By the end of the year his letters carried a fatalistic air. The only consolation is that it can't be worse, he wrote on December, the Nanking Safety Zone 127/30. They can't kill as many people as there aren't any more to kill. Frequently Wilson and the others saw the Japanese round up Chinese soldiers, shoot them, and stuff the bodies in dirt. Air raid shelters that doubled as mass graves. But Wilson heard that many Chinese people were executed not because they posed any threat to the Japanese army, but because their bodies served a practical purpose. After the fall of Nanking, the big trenches that the Chinese had built for tank traps were filled to the brim by Japanese, with the bodies of dead and wounded soldiers. When the Japanese failed to find enough bodies of dead soldiers, so tanks could pass over them, they shot nearby residents, and threw them in the trenches as well. The witness who told Wilson the story borrowed a camera so that he could take pictures to confirm his statements. There was very little Wilson could do to prevent these murders. The Japanese soldiers he confronted often made a point of conspicuously playing with their weapons, loading and unloading them, in order to intimidate him and other foreigners. Wilson fully expected to be shot in the back at any moment. One of the worst scenes Wilson saw in Nanking, a scene he would remember for the rest of his life, was a massive gang rape of teenage girls in the street. A group of young women, between the ages of 15 and 18, were lined up by the Japanese, and then raped in the dirt, one after another, by an entire regiment. Some hemorrhaged and died, while others killed themselves shortly afterwards. But the scenes in the hospitals were even more horrifying than those in the streets. Wilson was mortified by the women who came to the emergency room, with their bellies ripped open, by the charred and horribly disfigured men, whom the Japanese tried to bum alive, and by numerous other horrors he barely had time to describe on paper. He told his wife that he would never forget the woman whose head was nearly cut off, teetering from a point on her neck. This morning came another woman, in a sad plight and with a horrible story. A hospital volunteer wrote of this woman in his diary on January 3, 1938. She was one of the 5 women whom the Japanese soldiers had taken to one of their medical units to wash their clothes by day, to be raped by night. 2 of them were forced to satisfy from 15 to 20 men, and the prettiest one, as many as 40 each night. This one who came to us had been called off by 3 soldiers into an isolated place where they attempted to cut off her head. The muscles of the neck had been cut, but they failed to sever the spinal cord. She feigned death but dragged herself to the hospital, another of the many to bear witness to the brutality of soldiers. Yet in the midst of their pain and suffering, Wilson was amazed by the willpower of some of his patients. In a letter to his family, dated New Year's Day, 1938, he told an incredible account of survival. Chinese soldiers burned down the home of a 29-year-old woman in a tiny village south of Nanking, forcing her to head for the capital by foot with her 5 small children. Before nightfall, a Japanese airplane dove down at them, strafing the family with machine gun fire and sending a bullet through the mother's right eye and out her neck. She fainted in shock but awoke the next morning, lying in a pool of blood next to her crying children. Too weak to carry her youngest child, a 3-month-old baby, she left it behind in an empty house. Yet she somehow found the strength to struggle on to Nanking with her 4 remaining children, making her way successfully to the hospital. Wilson and other volunteers stayed in the hospital until they wavered on the verge of collapse. The International Committee could have used medical help from outside the city, but the Japanese would not permit doctors or medical volunteers to enter Nanking. So the burden of caring for the sick and administering the zone fell on this tiny beleaguered committee of no more than some 20 individuals. They worked in shifts to ensure that the hospital was guarded from the Japanese by at least one foreigner, 24 hours a day. Some of them became so overworked that they succumbed to colds, flu, and various other illnesses. During the massacre, the only other Western doctor in the city, C.S. Trimmer, struggled with a fever of 102 degrees. The Nanking Safety Zone 129, the University of Nanking Hospital, swiftly became another refugee camp because Wilson refused to discharge patients who had no place to go. Patients who did leave the hospital were accompanied by foreigners to ensure that they returned home safely. James McCallum acted as the hospital chauffeur, driving patients about town in unpainted, patched-up ambulances. Survivors of the massacre remember that the exhausted McCallum pressed cold towels against his face to stay awake as he drove patients home. But when even cold towels failed to keep his eyes open, McCallum resorted to chewing his tongue until it bled. Few people in Nanking pushed themselves as hard as Wilson did in the hospital. When the massacre and rapes gradually subsided, several of the other physicians went to Shanghai every weekend to recover from the strain. But Wilson continued to operate on patients relentlessly, day and night, around the clock. His selflessness was remembered almost 60 years later by survivors who spoke of Wilson with great reverence, at least one of them discussing in detail the preparation and successful result of his operation under Wilson's hands. He operated for free because few patients had money to pay him, but the surgeries exacted a terrible price from his own health. In the end, his family believes that only his faith as a devout Methodist, combined with his love for China, gave him the courage to survive the Rape of Nanking. The living goddess of Nanking, Wilhelmina Votrin, or Minnie Votrin, as most people called her, by occupation head of the Education Department and Dean of Studies at Jinling Women's Arts and Science College, was one of the few Western women in the city during the first few weeks of the Nanking Massacre. Years later, she would be remembered not only for her courage in protecting thousands of women from Japanese soldiers, but also for the diary she kept, a diary that some historians believe will eventually be recognized, much like the diary of Anne Frank, for its imper. Tense in illuminating the spirit of a single witness during a Holocaust of war. Votrin, the daughter of a blacksmith, was 51 years old in 1937. Raised in the tiny farming community of Secor, Illinois, she was sent to live with neighbors when her mother died 6 years later. In their homes, Votrin was often treated little better than a servant or field hand, and she found herself herding cattle during the bleakest months of winter. Despite the impoverishment of her childhood, she was able to work her way through school, graduating with honors in 1912 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Tall and handsome in her youth, with long dark hair, she was a vivacious and popular woman who attracted numerous suitors. But by the time she graduated from the University of Illinois, she had made up her mind to forego marriage. Instead, she joined the United Christian Missionary Association and moved to Hefei, a city in the Anhui province of China, where she worked for 7 years as the principal of a girls' school and learned to speak Chinese. Then Votrin moved to Nanking, to the position she held at the time of the massacre. Votrin was clearly very happy in Nanking. On visits to her hometown in Illinois, she talked incessantly of China, its culture, its people, and its history. She gave her family silkworm cocoons, and taught them how to cook and eat Chinese food. In her diary, she never ceased to marvel at the beauty of the Nanking landscape. An avid gardener, she planted roses and chrysanthemums at Jinling College, visiting greenhouses at Sun Yat-sen Memorial Park, walking down the fragrant lanes of plum and peach trees near the Ming tombs. In the summer of 1937, while vacationing with friends in the seaside summer resort of Tsingtao, Votrin heard that a Japanese soldier had disappeared a few miles south of Peking. The disappearance triggered several battles between the Chinese and Japanese in the area, prompting a friend of hers to comment darkly that the assassination of only 2 people in Sarajevo in 1914 had eventually culminated in the deaths of more than 11 million people. Still, Votrin refused to join the other Americans, evacuating the Nanking safety zone by Nanking, and so the American embassy lent her a new 9-foot American flag to lay flat on the center of the grassy quadrangle of Jinling College to protect the campus against Japanese pilots. The embassy staff also gave her and the other international committee members lengths of rope to knot into letters, and told them that once the Panay departed with the American embassy officials, and the Chinese military slammed all the gates shut, their only hope of escape would be over the city walls. But Votrin hardly had time to think about running away. With most of the faculty gone from Nanking, most had abandoned their homes to flee to cities like Shanghai and Chengdu. Votrin was now the acting head of the institution. She labored to prepare the campus for female refugees and to evacuate wounded soldiers from the area. To disguise their identities, she burned their military papers and garments in the college incinerator. Under her direction, furniture was moved into attics, safes were emptied, dorms were cleaned, and valuables were wrapped in oil paper and hidden. Meanwhile, posters, signs, and armbands for the Nanking safety zone were created and distributed among volunteers. Vautrin also commissioned the sewing of a second American flag, this one 27 feet long, but the Chinese tailor who put it together accidentally sewed the blue field with the stars on the lower left-hand comer instead of the upper. By the second week of December, the gates of Jinling opened for women and children. Thousands of people poured in. Refugees were passing through the city at the rate of 1,000 a day. Many of them, exhausted, bewildered, and hungry, came into the safety zone camps with only the clothing on their backs. From 8:30 this morning until 6 this evening, excepting for the noon meal, one have stood at the front gate while the refugees poured in, she continued. There is terror in the faces of many of the women. Last night was a terrible night in the city, and many young women were taken from their homes by the Japanese soldiers. Vautrin allowed the women and children to come in freely, but implored older women to stay home to leave space for the younger ones. Few women took her suggestion, and most begged just for a place to sit on the lawn. By the night of December 15, the population of the camps at Jinling had swelled to more than 3,000 people. The next day, Japanese soldiers stormed the college. At 10 a.m. on December 1, more than 100 Japanese troops burst onto the Jinling campus to inspect the buildings for hidden Chinese soldiers. They demanded that every door be opened, and if a key was not forthcoming, a Japanese soldier stood ready with an axe to break down the door by force. Vautrin's heart sank at the thought of the Japanese finding the hundreds of padded garments stored in the geography department office upstairs, but fortunately an attic packed with 200 Chinese women and children diverted the Japanese soldiers' attention. Vautrin later buried the garments to hide them from the Japanese. Twice that day the Japanese seized servants on campus and started to drag them away. They certainly would have been killed if Vautrin had not rescued them with cries of "No saldi or coolie." Only later did she learn that the Japanese had trained at least 6 machine guns on the campus, with many more soldiers on guard outside ready to shoot anyone who attempted to run away. That evening Vautrin saw women being carted away in the streets and heard their desperate pleas. A truck went by with 8 to 10 girls, and as it passed she heard them scream, "Juming! Juming! Save our lives!" The following day, December 17, 1937, was even worse. The migration of women into Jinling only intensified as Japanese soldiers flooded the city. What a heartbreaking sight, Vautrin wrote. Weary women, frightened girls, trudging with children and bedding, and small packages of clothes. If only someone had time to write the story of each refugee who came in, she thought, especially the stories of the girls who had blackened their faces and cut their hair. As she accommodated the stream of wild-eyed women, she heard stories of the Japanese raping girls as young as 12 and women as elderly as 60, or raping pregnant women at bayonet point. The harried Vautrin, the Nanking Safety Zone 133, spent the entire day trying to secure food for the refugees, direct Chinese men to other camps in the safety zone, and run to areas on campus where Japanese soldiers had been sighted. But nothing prepared Vautrin for the encounter that awaited her that evening. 2 Japanese soldiers were pulling at the door of the central building, demanding that Vautrin open it immediately, but when she insisted that she had no key and that no soldiers were hiding inside, a Japanese soldier slapped her in the face and also struck the Chinese man next to her. Then she saw 2 Japanese soldiers lead away 3 bouncer vans from the college. She followed them to the front gate where the Japanese had forced a large group of Chinese to kneel beside the road. The Japanese demanded to speak to the master of the institution, and learning that it was Vautrin, ordered her to identify every kneeling person. One man in the party spoke up to help Vautrin, and for this he was slapped severely. In the midst of this ordeal, 3 committee members drove up. The YMCA Secretary George Fitch, the Nanking University Sociology Professor Louis Smythe, and the Presbyterian missionary W. Plumer Mills. The soldiers forced the 3 men to stand in line and frisked them for pistols. Suddenly they heard screams and cries and saw the Japanese dragging women out of the side gate. It was only then that Vautrin realized that the entire interrogation was a ploy to keep the foreigners at the front gate while other Japanese soldiers searched the campus for women to rape. Never shall I forget that scene, she wrote, remembering her rage and helplessness. The people kneeling at side of road, Mary Miss Uston, and I standing, the dried leaves rattling, the moaning of the wind, the cry of women, being let out. For the next few months, Botrin often found herself one of the sole defenders of the refugee camps at Jinling College. Japanese soldiers constantly harassed the refugees, thereby rounding up men for execution or women for military brothels. Sometimes their recruitment tactics were brazen. On at least one occasion, Japanese soldiers drove up to campus with a truck and asked for girls. Most of the time, however, the kidnapping of women for rape was done covertly. Soldiers jumped over bamboo fences at night or broke open the side or back gates to seize random women in the darkness. Expeditions that began to be known throughout the populace as the lottery. On New Year's Day, 1938, Botrin rescued a girl whom a soldier had dragged into a bamboo grove north of the library. On several occasions, her heroism nearly cost Botrin her life. Many of the soldiers were fierce and unreasonable toward her, brandishing bayonets reddened with fresh blood stains. Botrin wrote that in some cases they are defiant and look at me with a dagger in their eyes and sometimes a dagger in their hands. One time, when she tried to stop Japanese soldiers from looting, one of them aimed a gun at her. Sometimes in her dealings with the Japanese, Botrin made mistakes, just as Rabe and the other committee members had been duped by the Japanese into handing over men for execution. Botrin appears to have been duped into delivering innocent women into the arms of Japanese soldiers. On December 24, Botrin was summoned to her office to meet with a high Japanese military officer and an elderly Chinese interpreter who discussed with her the Japanese Army's need for prostitutes. The request was that they be allowed to pick out the prostitute women from her 10,000 refugees. Botrin later wrote of the meeting in her diary. They said they wanted 100. They feel if they can start a regular licensed place for the soldiers, then they will not molest innocent and decent women. Strangely enough, Botrin granted the request. Perhaps she had no choice in the matter, or perhaps she actually believed that once the Japanese left with the prostitutes for their military brothel, they would stop bothering the virgins and respectable matrons in the refugee camps. Whatever the reasons behind her decision, it is safe to assume that Botrin made it under pressure. She waited while the Japanese conducted their search, and after a long time, they finally secured 21 women. The Japanese were able to distinguish these women as prostitutes. Botrin does not say, but she did mention that the Japanese were dissatisfied with the result because they were convinced that more prostitutes were hiding somewhere in the zone. Group after group of girls have asked me if they will select the other 79 from among the decent girls, and all I can answer is that they will not do so if it is in my power to prevent it, she wrote. A week after the city fell, the Japanese began a systematic effort to regulate activity within the zone. The commander of the military police of the Japanese Army made a proclamation, effective December 24, dictating that all civilians obtain passports, also called good citizens papers, from the issuing office of the Japanese Army. No one was allowed to get a passport for someone else, and those without passports would not be allowed to live within the Nanking city walls. The military posted bulletins in the streets notifying people to register or face the risk of being executed. On December 28, registration of the men began. At Jinling College, they formed lines of 4, received copies of forms, and marched to a house at the northeast corner of the campus, where the Japanese recorded their names, ages, and occupations. Botrin noticed that the men who arrived for registration were mainly old or maimed because most of the young men had already fled the city or been killed. Among those who showed up, more men were taken away as ex-soldiers, leaving behind old men and women who wept and kneeled before the safety zone leaders, begging them to secure the release of their husbands and sons. In a few cases, the zone leaders were successful, but they noticed that the Japanese military officials were growing increasingly resentful of their interference. When the turnout of men for registration disappointed the Japanese, they tried to intimidate the populace into compliance. On December 30th, they announced that all who had not been registered by 2 p.m. the following day would be shot. This proved to be a bluff. One missionary wrote of the incident, but it frightened the people. The next morning, huge crowds of people dutifully appeared at the registration areas, many of whom had risen before 3 a.m. to ensure their place in line. The draconian threats of the Japanese had instilled such fear that by January 14 the authorities succeeded in registering at least 160,000 people. Then registration began for the women. At 9 a.m. on December 31, thousands of Chinese women gathered in front of the central building of Jinling College, where a Japanese military official lectured to them. Speeches were given first in Japanese, then translated into Chinese by an interpreter. "You must follow the old customs of marriage," Vatrin recalled them saying. "You must not study English or go to theaters. China and Japan must be one." The women were then marched single file in 2 lines through frames set up for selling rice, where they were given tickets. Vatrin observed that the Japanese soldiers seemed to get a great deal of amusement herding the women about like cattle, sometimes putting the stamp on their cheeks. The soldiers also forced the women to smile and look happy for Japanese newsmen and photographers, even though the mere prospect of registration had made some women literally ill with fear. At times the Japanese registration of Chinese women seemed to Vatrin nothing less than a full-scale inspection of the most attractive candidates for rape. On the very first day of female registration, the Japanese scrutinized certain women in the zone and tried to take them away. They had singled out 20 girls, no doubt for prostitution, because they had curled hair or dressed too well. But all were released, Vatrin later wrote, because a mother or some other person could vouch for them. After registration, the Japanese tried to eliminate the zone itself. In late January, the Japanese announced that they wanted everyone out of the camps and back into their homes by the end of the month. February 4th was given as the deadline for evacuation. When the deadline arrived, Japanese soldiers inspected Jinling College and ordered the remaining girls and women to leave. When Vatrin told the inspectors that they could not leave because they were from other cities, or there are the Nanking Safety Zone 137 homes had burned down, the Japanese announced that the military police would assume the responsibility of protecting them. Vatrin was wary of these promises, and even the Chinese interpreter, who came with the Japanese to deliver their messages, whispered to Vatrin that he felt the young women were not safe and should continue to stay where they were. The sheer number of refugees eventually overwhelmed Vatrin. Hundreds of women crammed themselves into verandas and covered ways head to feet, and many more women slept outside on the grass at night. The attic of Jinling's Science Hall housed more than 1,000 women, and a friend of Vatrin's noted that women slept shoulder to shoulder on the cement floor for weeks on end during the cold winter months. Each cement step in the building was the home of one person, and those steps are not more than 4 feet long. Some were happy to have a resting place on the chemistry lab tables, the water pipes, and other paraphernalia not interfering at all. The Rape of Nanking wore down Vatrin physically, but the mental torture she endured daily was far worse than her physical deterioration. "Oh God, control the cruel beastliness of the soldiers in Nanking tonight," she wrote in her diary. How ashamed the women of Japan would be if they knew these tales of horror. Under such pressure, it is remarkable that Vatrin still found the spirit to comfort others and give them a renewed sense of patriotism. When an old lady went to the Red Cross kitchen at Jinling College to fetch a bowl of rice porridge, she learned that there was no porridge left. Vatrin immediately gave her the porridge she had been eating, and said to her, "Don't you people worry. Japan will fail. China will not perish." Another time, when she saw a boy wearing an armband marked with the Japanese symbol of the rising sun to ensure his safety, Vatrin scolded him and said, "You do not need to wear this rising sun emblem. You are Chinese and your country has not perished. You should remember the date you wear this thing, and you should never forget." Again and again, Vatrin urged the Chinese refugees on campus never to lose faith in their future. "China has not perished," she told them. "China will never perish, and Japan will definitely fail in the end." Others could see how hard she was working. "She didn't sleep from morning till night," one Chinese survivor recalled. She kept watching, and if Japanese soldiers came, she would try her best to push them out, and went out to their officials to pray them not to do so much evil things to the Chinese women and children. It was said that once she was slapped several times by beastly Japanese soldiers, another wrote in his eyewitness account of the Nanking Massacre. Everyone was worried about her. Everyone tried to comfort her. She still fought for the cause of protecting Chinese women, with courage and determination, from beginning to end. The work of running the zone was not only physically taxing, but psychologically debilitating. Christian Kruger, a Nazi member of the International Committee, claimed that he saw so many corpses in the streets that he soon suffered nightmares about them. But in the end, under unbelievable circumstances, the zone saved lives. Here are some startling facts. Looting and arson made food so scarce that some Chinese refugees ate the Michaelmas daisies and goldenrod growing on the Jinling College campus, or subsisted on mushrooms found in the city. Even the zone leaders went hungry from lack of meals. They not only provided free rice to the refugees through soup kitchens, but delivered some of it directly to refugee compounds because many Chinese in the zone were too scared to leave their buildings. Bookish and genteel, most of the zone leaders had little experience in handling a horde of rapists, murderers, and street brawlers, yet they acted as bodyguards for even the Chinese police in the city, and somehow, like warriors, found the physical energy and raw courage to throw themselves in the line of fire. Wrestling Chinese men away from execution sites, knocking the Nanking safety zone, 09 Japanese soldiers off of women, even jumping in front of cannons and machine guns to prevent the Japanese from firing. In the process, many zone leaders came close to being shot, and some received blows or cuts from Japanese soldiers wielding bayonets and swords. For example, Charles Riggs, a University of Nanking professor of agricultural engineering, was struck by an officer when he tried to prevent him from tacking away a group of Chinese civilians, mistaken as soldiers. The infuriated Japanese officer threatened Riggs with his sword 3 times and finally hit him hard over the heart twice with his fist. A Japanese soldier also threatened Professor Minor Cyril Bates with a pistol. Another soldier pulled a gun on Robert Wilson when he tried to kick out of the hospital a soldier who had crawled into bed with 3 girls. Still another soldier fired a rifle at James McCallum and C.S. Trimmer, but missed. When Minor Cyril Bates visited the headquarters of the Japanese military police to learn the fate of a university middle school student who had been tied up and carried off by soldiers, the Japanese shoved Bates down a flight of stairs. Even the swastikas the Nazis carried about like amulets occasionally failed to protect them from assault. On December 22, John Rabe wrote that Christian Kruger and another German named Hatz were attacked when they tried to save a Chinese man who had been wounded in the throat by a drunken Japanese soldier. Hatz defended himself with a chair, but Kruger apparently ended up being tied and beaten. The zone eventually accommodated some 300,000 refugees, almost half the Chinese population left in the city. The last is a chilling statistic when placed in the context of later studies of the Nanking Massacre. Half the original inhabitants of Nanking left before the massacre. About half of those who stayed, 350,000 people, out of the 700,000 Chinese refugees, native residents, and soldiers in the city, when it fell, were killed. If half of the population of Nanking fled into the safety zone during the worst of the massacre, then the other half, almost everyone who did not make it to the zone, probably died at the hands of the Japanese. 6 What th 6 wops.ldkjm 6 wvixt world was not kept in the dark about the rape of Nanking. News of the massacre continuously reached the global public while events unfolded. 4 months before the fall of Nanking, numerous foreign correspondents lived in the capital to cover its aerial bombardment by Japanese aviators. As the Japanese army neared the doomed capital in early December, reporters provided vivid and almost daily coverage of bats, fires, last-minute evacuations, and the creation of the International Safety Zone. Amazingly, when the massacre began, Japan's newspapers ran photographs of Chinese men being rounded up for execution, heaps of bodies waiting for disposal by the riverside, the killing contests among the Japanese soldiers, and even the shocked commentary of the reporters themselves. Apparently before International Opinion 143 kicked in, the first few days of the massacre were a source of tremendous pride to the Japanese government. Celebrations broke out across Japan when the people heard the news of Nanking's defeat. Special meals of Nanking noodles were prepared in Tokyo, and children across Japan carried globe-shaped, candlelit paper lanterns in evening parades to symbolize the ascendancy of the rising sun. It was only later, after news of the sinking of the Panay and the butchering of Nanking citizens had met with international condemnation, that the Japanese government quickly tried to hide what its army had done and replaced the news with propaganda. Thanks to the efforts of a few American journalists, the Japan as a nation soon faced a scandal of gargantuan proportion. The American journalists, the journalists who had the greatest influence on Western foreign opinion at the time, were three American foreign correspondents: Frank Tillman Durden of the New York Times, Archibald Steele of the Chicago Daily News, and C. Yates McDaniel of the Associated Press. An adventurous streak ran through all three men. Durden, a 29-year-old reporter from Houston, had spent time mopping decks and cleaning winches on a freighter to secure free passage from the United States to China. Once in Shanghai, he worked for a daily English-language newspaper, and soon moved on to the Times to cover the Sino-Japanese War. Steele was an older correspondent who had reported on the Japanese occupation of Manchuria and the expanding Asian War. McDaniel was perhaps the most daring of the three. Before the massacre, he had driven through battle lines in the countryside, barely escaping death from exploding shells during his quest to find the war. Durden, Steele, and McDaniel left only a few days after the massacre began, but in the brief time they were in Nanking, they made an enormous impact. Not only did they write riveting stories that were splashed across the biggest and most what the world knew, 145 prestigious newspapers in the United States, but they also joined the International Safety Zone Committee in trying to save lives. The Rape of Nanking forced the reporters out of their normal role as neutral observers and into the war drama as full-fledged participants. Sometimes they starred in their own stories by choosing to protect Chinese citizens from the Japanese invaders. For instance, C. Yates McDaniel assumed the responsibility of guarding the Chinese servants of the U.S. Embassy. During the massacre, most were so frightened they refused to leave the building even for water, and McDaniel spent hours filling buckets with well water and lugging them back to the embassy for the servants to drink. He tried to find their missing relatives, often retrieving only their bodily remains, and also chased away Japanese soldiers who tried to break into the embassy. The reporters even tried to save people who were dearly beyond saving, if only to comfort those who were minutes away from death. During the massacre, Durden encountered a Chinese soldier lying on the sidewalk with his jaw shot away and his body bleeding. The soldier held out his hand, which Durden picked up and held. "I didn't know where to take him or what to do," Durden remembered years later. "So I just, stupidly, decided to do something. I just put a $5 bill in his hand." Which is utterly useless to him, of course, but anyway, somehow I felt the impulse to do something. He was just barely alive. On December 15th, most of the reporters left Nanking for Shanghai to file their stories. Their last day in the city was grisly. On the way to the waterfront, the reporters literally had to drive over several feet of bodies under the water gate, where dogs were already starting to gnaw on the corpses. Later, as they waited for their ship to arrive, they saw the Japanese military line up 1,000 Chinese men, force them to kneel in small groups, and shoot each of them in the back of the head. During the execution, some of the Japanese were laughing and smoking, as if they greatly enjoyed the entire spectacle. The AP's McDaniel stayed in Nanking a day longer before boarding a destroyer for Shanghai. On December 16th, his last day in the ruined Chinese capital, he saw more corpses, and passed a long line of Chinese men, with their hands tied. One of them broke away from the group, dropped on his knees, and begged McDaniel to save him from death. "One could do nothing," McDaniel wrote. "My last remembrance of Nanking, dead Chinese, dead Chinese, dead Chinese." the newsreel men. There were also 2 American newsreel men near Nanking, who risked their lives to film the bombing of the Panay. During the bombing, Norman Alley of Universal and Eric Maile of Fox Movietone happened to be on board and obtained superb footage of the action. Though they survived the attack unscathed, Alley emerged from the bombs and machine gun fire with only a nicked finger and a bullet-perforated hat. Another journalist was not so lucky. A splinter hit the Italian correspondent Sandro Sandri in the back of his eye when he followed Alley up a stairway on the Panay, and he died only hours later. While hiding with the surviving Panay passengers under the riverbank reeds, Ali wrapped his film and mails with canvas and buried it under the mud when he thought the Japanese were coming ashore to kill them. Later, the film was safely unearthed and shipped to the United States, where parts of the newsreel footage of the event ran in movie houses across the country. The sinking of the Panay caused more of an uproar in the United States than all the wholesale rape and slaughter in Nanking combined. On December 13, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced that he was shocked at the bombing and demanded immediate compensation from Emperor Hirohito. A few days later, when the exhausted survivors finally reached civilization, the public response only grew worse. Filthy cold, and wearing only blankets, Chinese quilts, and tatters of clothing, some of the survivors were still in shock or near death. Their stories, along with their photographs, soon appeared in every major newspaper in the country. Underhead Nanking fell to the Japanese on December 13, 1937. One layer the ecstatic Japanese celebrate by cheering on the walls of the city. Photo courtesy of Pictorial History of Sino-Japanese VWTR. Japanese tanks rumbled through Nanking on the morning of December 13, 1937. New China News Agency. On December 12, the Japanese Navy bombed and sank the USS Ianay, an American gunboat, on the Yangtze River, near the city of Nanking, even though it was packed with diplomats, journalists, businessmen, and refugees from Western countries. UPI/Corbis Bettman, an example of Japanese propaganda. The Japanese pasted this image all over Nanking, a poster displaying a kindly Japanese soldier holding a Chinese baby while giving food to his grateful parents. The posters urged the citizens, return to your homes. We will give you rice to eat. Trust and rely on the Japanese army, you can get help. Many of these posters were found near homes in which atrocities had occurred. Japanese army planes also dropped leaflets promising all good Chinese who return to their homes will be fed and clothed. Japan wants to be a good neighbor to those Chinese not fooled by monsters who are Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers. After such drops, thousands of Nanking citizens left the safety zone to return to their homes. John Rabe Collection, Yale Divinity School Library. General Matsui Iwane salutes his victorious troops as he enters the walled city of Nanking. Bettman. As the Japanese moved across China, they rounded up thousands of women. Many of them were gang raped or forced into military prostitution. Politburo of Military Committee, Taipei. December 16, 1937. 17 Japanese military police officers, inspecting a large crowd of Chinese civilians, so terrorized by the mass murder in the city that none dare raise any objection to the search. Central News Agency, Taipei. Japanese bound the wrists of young men in the city and loaded many of them onto trucks where they were transported to the outskirts of Nanking for mass execution. Mainchi Shimbun. The original caption reads, "This picture shows Japanese recruits at bayonet drill in Nanking after the capture of the Chinese capital. They are using Chinese prisoners for their targets. In the center, an unfortunate prisoner, for should we say fortunate, has just received the death thrust. In foreground, a bound Chinese is being lightly pricked with the bayonet in order to get him into position for the coup de grace." As to the authenticity of the photo, it was sent to look by W.A. Farmer of Hankow, who says the photograph was made by a Japanese soldier. The film was sent to Shanghai to be developed. Chinese employees in the Japanese-owned shop made extra prints and smuggled them out. UPI/Bettman. Blindfolded and propped on 2 sticks, this poor man served as the living target for a Japanese officer's sword practice. An infantryman finishes the job. WHH bayonet thrusts that continue even after the victim's death. Politburo of Military Committee, Taipei. 5 Chinese prisoners being buried alive by their Japanese captors outside Nanking after the fall of the Chinese capital. This is another picture that was sent to Look magazine by W.A. Farmer after it was taken by a Japanese soldier and smuggled out by Chinese film shop employees who did the natural thing in exceeding the printing order UPI/Betman. Sword were popular in Nanking. Here the victim's decapitation. New China News. The head of a Chinese soldier, placed on a barbed wire barricade outside Nanking, with a cigarette butt inserted between his lips as a joke. Alliance for Preserving the Truth of Sino-Japanese War. In Nanking, Japanese turned murder into spawn. Note the smiles on the Japanese in the background. Revolutionary documents. Type A. The Japanese media avidly covered the army's killing contests near Nanking. In one of the most notorious, 2 Japanese sublieutenants, Mukai Toshiaki and Noda Takeshi, went on separate beheading sprees near Nanking to see who could kill 100 men first. The Japan Advertiser ran their picture under the bold headline, "Contest to kill first 100 Chinese, with sword extended when both fighters exceed mark." Mukai scores 106 and Noda 105. Japan Advertiser. The Japanese bound this young woman to a chair for repeated attack. New China News Agency. Nanking women were not only raped, but tortured and mutilated. Modem China Publishing. I***.1**4*5% arson, destroyed 1/3 of Nanking, during the massacre. Here J troops set fire to a house in the suburbs. New China News Agency. During the massacre, thousands of Chinese refugees fled into the Nanking safety zone, war-free territory, guarded by a handful of Westerners. Lira zone meant the difference between life and death for the remaining Chinese in the city, and eventually housed more than 300,000 people. Nanking Municipal Archives. Japanese soldiers ride through a devastated and young, the Rape of Nanking, neighborhood of Nanking in the foreigners, also established a rural safety zone outside Nanking. Ernest H. Forster, Yale Divinity School Library. A page from John Rabe's Diaries of the Nanking Massacre. John Rabe Collection, Yale Divinity School Library. Find Leo F1I, E.G. Tilber Hanking. I am Persangabuk Bladder John H.D. Rabe, Nanking left bracket tilde I.ZT, Oeberseal Telid Blumwurdi asterisk. Slebiestlut DD8, Jme 1958. John Rabe's letter to Hitler, which he submitted along with a report and film of die atrocities. A few days later Rabe was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo in Berlin. John Rabe Collection, Yale Divinity School Library. Isla Mersal seiner Ruid, in Sies first der Meung, des ich über die Slokb, Erlg Sief and Farlicker Serik der Stadtward asterisk. Dirk die Oebersendung der Bierbilligedia Hederachluxt Levo Asurgeheituers Vortragia, der Elcht Fr, die Britoks Festlich Elbester Sty asterisk T, Erksfleil Iok Elabellian Fruns. L asterisk T Kieg Pabia Verspricts Spaya von die Leiden Dirk Bisessi Aki BVSIKERING La X asterisk SKING Untagabik. Kieskissi first Earth 81, it/Wiesel, die Gate Babes OUAR. Kisses ZB Lasses, DSS equal, Dysenligic Niederskultrixes Bnsvorgklet Edward. Ich bio is also Hioverstedig Troordik, Tort Rage Dieser Art ZB Ekterlikuk, Aori die DAICGEB, 5RLGES, Abxafacia det at. Zygon let asterisk rage dieser Kruang X5GES die bike diebsicht babe der Dietspen Folitlukas den Dektseben Sekredak Kot Giesk Suarbiti. Ich Kursikir Ciauer Trusgexolgskbakstud Tsar Oxlukagio Schurgbeschelt December Fibrot Sad P.Elchikangsler Cares Edklukspitier, Erlb. Dr. Robert Wilson, the only surgeon in Nanking, during the massacre. Yale Divinity School Library. Dr. Wilson examines a gang rape victim, whose head was almost severed by the Japanese. In a deserted schoolhouse, 2 soldiers struck this woman 10 times with a bayonet, once on the wrist, once on the face, 4 times on the back, and 4 times on her neck, which slashed the muscles down to the vertebral column. John McGee. Scenes from Nanking University Hospital, where E. Wilson worked. This teenage boy's head was charred black after the Japanese doused it with gasoline and set it on fire. John McGee. This 14-year-old boy was imprisoned by the Japanese, starved, and then severely beaten with an iron bar when he begged to go home. John McGee. Lee Zoyan, who barely eluded rape after fighting 3 Japanese soldiers and enduring 37 bayonet wounds. 7 months pregnant during the fight, she suffered a miscarriage in the hospital. She did not recover from her wounds for another 7 months. John McGee. Minnie Vautrin, the living goddess of Nanking, courtesy of MUL.Yan. Minor Cyril Bates, history professor at Nanking University and chairman of the International Committee after May 1939 Yale Divinity School Library. Organizers of the Nanking Safety Zone SESSSKISAST_R.Sira. During the war crimes trials.